We reported about how Joe Biden had decided, finally, to allow the Ukrainians to use these ATACMS, these Army Tactical Missile System ballistic missiles, ground-launched systems against targets inside Russia. That was a huge shift in policy, in part because of Russia's decision to escalate the war with the introduction of North Korean troops on the ground fighting alongside Russian soldiers against Ukrainian forces. And at that time, on Sunday, when we were reporting on that, we were speculating that it would be likely for the UK to have done the same. And while Keir Starmer, while he's been here actually in Rio de Janeiro for the last couple of days, was asked repeatedly whether or not the UK had sanctioned the use of its Storm Shadow cruise missiles. These are weapons that are launched from jets against targets on the ground. He was very careful to avoid giving any kind of indication either way on that. And so it really was a case of it being a matter of time until there's evidence on the ground of those missiles being used, or until sources started to talk about it. And over the course of the last hour or so, a number of media outlets had started to report that this is the case, and a source has just told me that this is the case. But as I said, it remains to be seen whether we get official confirmation on this from the UK or from Ukraine.
Deborah Haynes there, and that news from Deborah came almost at the same time as the Defence Secretary was on his feet in the House of Commons. Let's have a listen to what he said about what some would call defence cuts, others would call savings.
This is not just about how much you spend on defence, it's how you spend that counts, which is why we're conducting a strategic defence review at pace to assess the threats we face and the capabilities that we will need in the future. And it's also why I've introduced tight financial controls on the department, including a £300 million reduction in planned consultancy spending. Madam Deputy Speaker, we're getting a grip of MOD budgets and investing in people and in future technologies. Today, with full backing from our service chiefs, I can confirm that 6 outdated military capabilities will be taken out of service. These decisions are set to save the MOD £150 million over the next 2 years and up to £500 million over 5 years.
Let's talk now to our political correspondent, Ali Fortescue, who is with us now. Ali, can you just explain what's happening? Because on the surface, it looks like a strange time to be announcing cuts to military equipment when they've said that they're going to boost defence spending as a proportion of GDP. And of course, we all know the situation internationally.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I think the context really matters, and I guess in a sense the optics too. As you say, this is a day where UK supplied missiles, sources told us, have been fired into Russia by Ukrainian soldiers. A week where we've had the G20 overshadowed, of course, by conflict not just in Ukraine, in the Middle East as well, and questions about what a second Trump presidency is going to look like, what that means for defence spending. Is that a moment where you want to be announcing, cuts or savings to defence? The Defence Secretary said that this is about modernisation. He said this is overdue. You will hear a different view in a moment from the Shadow Defence Secretary. I should say, former Armed Forces Minister, Conservative John Healey, he wrote on X, he said this is not the end of the world. And I guess in a sense, some of this equipment is outdated. It's not necessarily what you'd expect to be used in modern warfare, but is the money that it saves going to be enough to replace it with more modern equipment? It's not just being put in the deep freeze, it's being kind of completely decommissioned. And of course, there's lots of questions about spending more broadly. £3 billion was put in the budget, but that's just a top up, it's not long term. Obviously, the question of 2.5%, that is something the Conservatives see as a real dividing line. The government have not set a target for when they want that to happen. We do spend more than many other NATO countries, but we have not hit that target of 2.5%. Obviously, there's going to be more pressure on that when Donald Trump enters the White House. I should also quickly say the Strategic Defence Review is coming up, we expect, very soon. That is going to give us a sense of what this government's priorities are. I think today, we've got a bit of a sense from the Defence Secretary of what the priorities might and might not be.
We'll get the full picture, as you say, when that review comes out. Ali, thank you very much indeed, Ali Fortescue there. Well, she just mentioned him in the live there, but joining us now is the Shadow Defence Secretary, James Cartledge. It's great to have him on the programme. Thanks for being here. So is this the right move by the Defence Secretary?
Well, I became Shadow Defence Secretary after the election, and at the in the King's Speech debate in July, I specifically warned that if the government did not urgently set out a pathway to 2.5%, they would have to make cuts immediately. That's what I predicted, and this is what's come true today. So I'm very disappointed because, as you rightly said, as you've said throughout the programme today, doesn't it seem an extraordinary time to be making these cuts when the world is self-evidently getting more dangerous and the threats to our country have grown?
I guess what other people would say is, look, this is the right move because, frankly, this system is out of date. It needs modernising. And, it's not just the Defence Secretary, John Healey, saying that. Here's, James Heapy, the former Conservative Defence Minister. He said it's not necessarily the end of the world. Creating headroom to invest in new tech is vital.
So if you look at Ukraine, one of the big lessons from Ukraine is that actually you have to get all the kit you've got if you're going to fight. And the thing that's so important now is...
But you have to make decisions in defence and priorities. And this is not just like, you just spend this money on this equipment and then that's it, it's done. There's costs for upkeep. That money could be better used, some would argue, on new technology that is better suited to modern warfare.
But the problem will be, having been in the Ministry of Defence, because I had the procurement job, I was very involved in the budget planning and so on. I knew that if we didn't put in more funding, you would have these sorts of pressures. And the reason for that is pretty straightforward. When Putin invaded Ukraine, massive spike in inflation, the whole world trying to buy military equipment, so the forward cost of what we call the equipment plan, that was the military plan for future spending, has gone up. So there's more pressure. That's why we needed to set that plan for 2.5% immediately, not wait for a defence review. Frankly, I think the Secretary of State knows that. And so we've got this delay on the extra spending, and in the interim, the gap is having to be filled by these sorts of decisions. If you take the example of the landing docks, which are used to deploy the Royal Marines, we've had this announcement on Bulwark and Albion. I said in the Chamber today that I was assured if they were held in what we call extended readiness, if the balloon went up, i.e. war fighting scenario, and they were the thing that was needed, they could be used.
Will you acknowledge that part of the reason that we're in the situation we are is because of underinvestment under the Conservative Party as well? I'm just going to read you what Ben Wallace, the former Conservative Defence Secretary, said last year in a very frank exchange. He said the military had been hollowed out by years of underfunding, in which he included the Conservatives. Do you acknowledge that?
Yeah, and John Healey referred to that today, although... Ben was clear, but just for the record, Ben was referring to successive governments, so yes, that includes Conservatives. Yeah. But the numbers speak for themselves, right? Since 1989, when the Cold War finished, defence spending has fallen pretty much year on year.
So you acknowledge that you agree then with Ben Wallace that under the Conservative government, and I know you're talking about others as well, but under the last Conservative government, defence spending was hollowed out?
I still think we can be very proud of our record. I mean, particularly, of course, in supporting Ukraine. The most recent NATO exercise, the largest NATO exercise since the Cold War...
Did you spend enough money on defence?
Well, you judge it by the outcomes, don't you? The largest NATO exercise since the Cold War, Steadfast Defender, we had the largest number of personnel, 20,000 personnel in that exercise. If we fight with NATO. And so it's incredibly important to stress our armed forces are still among the world's best. But yes, there are challenges. I've just said it and I'll say it again, there was massive pressure on the defence budget from inflation. So that's why we set out a funded plan to get to 2.5% in April.
I'm not really sure what your answer to the question is about whether or not you spent enough on defence during the last Conservative government.
What I said was defence spending has fallen successively since the Cold War, under Labour, under Conservative. So I'm being completely clear with you. Yes, defence spending fell under the Conservatives. And
that was a mistake, you think?
Well, in 2010, we had a country where the previous government left a note there was no money left. The country was on the verge of bankruptcy.
Was it a mistake?
No, it wasn't, because the national interest then was to get our finances straight. But once we got them straight, the biggest increase in defence spending since the Cold War was under Rishi Sunak in 2019, and we had a funded plan for 2.5%. The fact the government have delayed their plan is why they're having to make these cuts.
I want to talk to you about UK-built missiles being fired into Ukraine. Into Russia by Ukraine for the first time. Yeah. Is that something you're comfortable with?
So, as you'll appreciate, I did ask this of John Healey. I raised a point of order after his statement on the defence cuts, and I asked about this, and he said that they will not comment on the operation. So we can't know for certain that is the case. Obviously, there have been reports in the media, and I accept that. So our position is we wanted the government to grant Ukraine full autonomy. But it's clear, and I think this will continue, the government, and I have some sympathy as a former defence minister, they're not going to give you confirmation or do a sort of running commentary on the operational side.
I understand, but in principle, you are comfortable with the idea of UK-built equipment being used by Ukraine to fire into Russia?
Yeah, on Monday we called for this. I mean, we've been very clear on that.
What do you think a Donald Trump presidency will mean for the war? He obviously, in the campaign, said he was going to end it in 24 hours if he became president.
I think there's been a massive development, and the appearance of 10,000 North Korean troops is hugely significant strategically. I think, in the Pentagon, throughout the US political system, I'm sure they'll be watching that and thinking, hold on a minute, this is a major escalation. Just imagine how Russia would feel if there were suddenly 10,000 NATO troops facing them. And North Korea has many, many more. So I think, perhaps this is changing views in the US. I certainly hope that is the case. And I would also say in terms of Donald Trump, he will be keenly aware, I'm sure, that we don't want to show potential adversaries, including other major powers, that we are weak. We want to show that we're united. And I'm pleased that the US remains strong in its support for Ukraine, and I obviously hope that continues, whoever, under Donald Trump's administration.
OK, thank you very much indeed. Great to have you on the programme today. James Cartledge there is the Shadow Defence Secretary. All those stories on Ukraine and UK defence are sure to feature in tomorrow's newspapers. We'll have our extended press preview from 10:30 this evening with tonight's news and tomorrow's headlines. Joining us will be the Daily Mirror's associate editor, Kevin Maguire, and the Daily Mail's Whitehall editor, Claire Ellicott. Right, let's bring in our duo for this evening, shall we? The Labour MP, Rachel Maskell, and the former Conservative Minister, Ranil Jayawardena. Thank you very much for being here, both of you. Ranil, to you first. What do you make of the cuts announced today? Is this kind of a sensible modernisation, or is it something that you're more concerned about?
I'm very concerned to hear this today, and I come at it from my old constituency experience. I represented RAF Odium, where the Chinooks are based, and it's an amazing platform that's been used all over the world, and indeed here at home in times of crisis. It's a platform that even the government today say they know they need to buy more of in 2027. But they're getting rid of over a dozen now, and it just doesn't seem to make sense given the huge risks that Britain and her allies face right now. So it seems really poor timing and quite ill-conceived, really.
I mean, there has been obviously an increase to defence in the budget, and they've set out the ambition to get to 2.5% of GDP, but no date on it. Do you think that that needs to be sped up, or are you comfortable with the current plan?
Well, this is all about a process because, of course, we've got the Strategic Defence Review, which is going to be reporting soon, and that will set out the strategy. And I think, first of all, we need to understand what that will contain, particularly if we need to modernise our armed forces and the equipment they are to use. So let's take this in the right sequence as we move forward. Of course, in reviewing his department, John Healey would have seen significant waste and also old equipment, which he would have been advised needs to be stood down, particularly if we look at things like the 300 million being spent on consultants, being able to divert that money into future investment and modern equipment is absolutely the right thing to do. And I'm sure, knowing John, he would have done a really massive piece of due diligence before even entering into these discussions. And ultimately, what we've got to think about is where not only the global challenges are coming forward, but how do we build that security in the future?
Yeah, let's talk a bit about these global challenges, because we've, of course, seen, according to sources, UK-supplied weapons being fired into Russia. And there'll be lots of people who think this is absolutely what needs to happen. If we say that we're going to support Ukraine, we need to give them the tools that they need to win the war. And there'll be others who will say, perhaps more quietly, that they're quite fearful about what this means for the UK. What's your take on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've got to be careful that we don't inadvertently escalate this further. So perhaps I'm saying the quiet part out loud here, but clearly North Koreans have escalated it by putting troops on the border. But we've got to now use the window, I think. Britain, giving the opportunity to use these capabilities. We've got to use this window to hopefully find a route that does de-escalate it. And it will be very interesting to see what path President Trump wishes to take when he takes office.
Because this is the thing, isn't it? There's some people who think, you can't appease Putin, right? He's a dictator. He will see any weakness as something that he will seize more. Then there'll be others who say ending a war is all about compromise. I don't know.
Well, I mean, it's very interesting that during the time that President Trump was in office last, Putin didn't make any further incursions. This is after Crimea had already been annexed, but he didn't make any further incursions during that time. And that showed, I think, the sense that Russia wasn't willing to take a risk in the face of a strong American government. So, I think there's got to be some hope that there is a route through with a new administration in the US. Hopefully, as I say, the fact that Russia's having to move back as a result of this additional capability being brought on stream right now does buy a bit of time and a little bit of a window to do that.
Rachel, Jeremy Corbyn has come out today saying that Keir Starmer needs to come and make a statement in the House if he is going to allow the use of military weapons in this way. Do you agree with that?
I do. I mean, these are hugely challenging times, there's no doubt about it. And of course, the transition in the US is having its ramifications around the globe, and we can see that. And certainly, I'm sure there's some attribution of what's happening in Ukraine and Russia at the moment. But what's really clear is that there has been an incursion into Ukraine, and Zelensky has made it absolutely clear as a sovereign state how he wants to address that, and he has to have the space and the capacity to do that. But Parliament has got a role in this, and of course we understand around national security and international security and those strategic decisions how they're made, but they've also got to be held to account, and that's why I think it's really important that the Prime Minister does come to Parliament and that MPs have the opportunity to scrutinise that, but also to debate how we should move forward, because we can see the geopolitics now spreading not just from Russia but outside of that as well, into the Middle East and beyond. And of course, with the world so unstable as it is at the moment, 43 wars across our planet as we speak, we have got to now look at whether the mechanisms within the UN and wider international courts are sufficient for containing and addressing the global instabilities that we're seeing at this time.
Thanks both very much indeed. Really important discussion to have tonight. Thank you. Now, the use of social media by young people is one of the greatest challenges facing government, parents, and of course the social media giants themselves. And there's been so many tragic cases from Morley Russell to Brenna Jai where social media use has been cited as a factor in their deaths. Now, in Australia, the government has decided to ban under-16s from social media platforms. And today, the Technology Secretary here, Peter Kyle, told us it's something they're looking at in the UK as well.
Into the long term, there's nothing I would take off the table to keep young people safe. But I do need to look at the evidence and see what will have the right impact and have the right behaviour change that we want. I mean, right now, what I'm doing is doing everything I can do to move to a situation where safety is baked in from the start, where safety by design, which is the whole purpose of the Online Safety Act in the first place, but we're not there by some measure yet. I realise this can't be done in a big bang. There's not going to be one big moment I can do, either rhetorically or legislatively, that's going to solve this problem. And also, it's a global issue. But what I'm trying to do is use all the powers I do so that safety is there from the outset.
Our political correspondent Tamara Cohen joins us now. Look, this is almost, I think, the greatest challenge for parents at the minute, working out how much internet, how much social media their kids should use and whether they've got any control over it at all. Do you think this ban might actually come in then?
Well, I think he says nothing is off the table in terms of a ban, but I think the question that parents and teachers and medical professionals who are concerned about this have is how quickly are things moving? Because a major piece of legislation was passed last year, the Online Safety Act. It was quite a big battle to protect children from harmful and illegal content, violence, explicit material, and so on. That hasn't been implemented yet. That's happening next year. And one of Peter Kyle's messages was to the regulator, Ofcom, to say be assertive in how you implement that, handing out fines and so on to make sure it really works. And if the tech companies don't comply, he says we might go further. But when it comes to a ban on smartphones under a certain age, a ban on social media under a certain age, he says we need to see more evidence. There isn't enough evidence there. And some people say there is enough evidence already. I spoke to Dr. Rebecca Fulgham, who's a GP who runs a group for medical professionals concerned about social media. This is what she told me when she came to Parliament today.
I feel really frustrated. We definitely have plenty of evidence to send Peter Kyle if that's what he would like to see. There is very robust evidence now that we've got 1 in 4 children who are using smartphones consistent in a way with addiction. So they find it difficult to put them down, they find it difficult to control their use, it stops them from doing things that they would otherwise enjoy. This is all the behaviour of addiction. They are much more likely, 2-3 times more likely to get anxiety and depression symptoms as a result of that problematic smartphone use.
Well, you really get the sense there, don't you, the sort of frustration that she feels. I guess some people might be saying there's already a ban on under-13s using social media. How on earth is this going to be policed?
Yes, and I think in Australia what they're doing there is being very closely looked at by the government. But there's also pressure here from Labour MPs. There's a Labour MP and former teacher called Josh McAllister who has drafted his own bill to try and restrict the use of social media apps among under-16. So they have versions which aren't so addictive. He's concerned not just about the harmful content, but how much time people are spending on these apps. He wants the government to go further, and I think there is pressure building from parents' groups. There's a group called Smartphone Free Childhood. We've got lots of parents who want much tougher restrictions, and I think the government is being questioned on how fast they are moving.
Tamara, thank you very much indeed. Tamara Cohen there. You're watching the Politics Hub. Coming up, we'll get reaction to that from our panel. Plus, as Keir Starmer returns from another whirlwind trip abroad, we'll be discussing the challenge the PM has balancing his foreign and domestic agendas. Plus, out of control, stores say they need help tackling a sharp rise in shoplifting. We'll have an exclusive report.
This is how you travel when the mafia wants to kill you.
He's almost given up his own freedom, but that's the price he's willing to pay.
Here, they don't just arrest and Ndrangheta mafia members, they also live among them.
Time after time, I've seen the devastating impact of extreme weather and climate change.
We don't have much snow at the moment.
They've had a warm spring and exceptionally hot summer, and that means they're expecting to lose more than 3 times the amount of ice than they usually do.
Flames are still forcing people from their homes and leaving many questioning their futures.
Here was my life. We have nothing. I can't say anything, it's so sad.
This disaster is testing the resolve of everyone on this island.
The only way out now is by boat.
Everything you see is devastated, and the misery being felt by people living here is repeated in towns and villages across Central Europe.
Sky News, get the full story first.
Turkey is burying its dead. The loss is profound.
Whole families died in this collapse, generations wiped out. The violence has penetrated the heart of the city rather than being contained to the estates around the edge, and that speaks to the level of anger being felt here.
In Sweden, police have seized a lethal stash. This is just a small sample of the deadly arsenal taken off the streets.
This is an example of an advert, really. Anyone of any age could say, I'll do that for £1 million, and then have to go and shoot someone.
Yes.
I'm Siobhan Robbins, Sky's Europe correspondent based here in Berlin.
Day of this conflict.
They keep telling us that they want aid.
And this is what's left of it.
Tanks, heavy vehicle.
Why only in America? People want their country to work.
Just want a job in a normal life.
Why are these homes empty?
I want you to be honest with people.
That has happened within minutes.
Sky News, the full story first. Free wherever you get your news.
Hello, welcome back. Well, before the break, we were hearing those calls for the government to ban the use of social media by under 16-year-olds. We can get the thoughts now of Rachel and Ranil. Rachel, what's your take on this?
I think we've got to take a public health approach to all of these measures. We know that increasingly algorithms using AI is driving young people into some quite unsavoury sites. So, of course, we want to be able to protect our young people. But the age of 13, to be able to use your phone in a school environment, does that really seem appropriate? Of course, young people are using tech all the time now in the classroom, and that's a positive thing because that will prepare them for the workplace. But to be scrolling the whole time, and of course it's not just during the day, phones are pinging all day long into the evening, in their bedrooms, into the night, and therefore being able not only to support young people and to address the issues around their mental well-being, their health, but also parents who have got to make these really difficult decisions. Does their child have a phone or not? And that puts huge pressure on parents, not least the cost of it, and then obviously how do they protect their children from the content which they could be scrolling.
I think that's it, isn't it? Because a lot of people might be like, look, the parents just do your job, just, you know, whenever you think it's right to give your phone, just hold out till then. But it can be quite hard with peer pressure, and it does feel, I guess, for some parents, that if the government came down a bit harder on this, that would help them out.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I like Peter, and I think he's on the right track here, but I would encourage him to go much further. I think, you know, the idea that you can ban social media without fundamentally banning smartphones is actually for the birds. I think, you know, just saying you're banning social media, children are brilliant at finding the workarounds and they will find the routes through. So I actually encourage them to go further and say, look, actually, children should not be using smartphones. If they need a phone, it can be a dumb phone. It's entirely possible to get around these things, and that would really support parents and teachers to provide a clear line in the sand.
So you would say no smartphones until you're 16?
Absolutely. I think a very clear line that says we're not going to even entertain the idea would be a great help to parents. I mean, parents are caught up in this arms race often with children at school. Once someone gets it, then everyone wants it. And actually, if there was that clarity, it'd be really helpful to parents. It'd also be great for teachers, so that teachers didn't have to police whether children were using phones in school or not. I mean, I remember my old 3210. All you could do was play Snake.
I remember Snake.
Right?
Oh, those are the days.
You know, if that's the worst that children can do, they'll be much more focused on their education.
I guess we're much more aware of the impact on mental health as well now, aren't we? You know, I remember when I was at school, you know, bullying was obviously an issue then, as it is now. Like, you know, these things are just part of life, sadly, if you're growing up. But you could kind of leave it at the school gates, whereas now, if you've got a smartphone, then that follows you wherever you are.
Well, absolutely. And I think we know that young people today have real challenges around their mental health. And of course, they're not getting the kind of one-to-one interactions either with their peers. So everything is online. And if we think about some of the issues like the sexting and things like that online, 96% of young people have been involved in that, of seeing images or having images put online. These young people are having a real distortion because of the social media they're using. So we've got to find those protections at the right levels, because clearly, as you say, young people do find their way around these as well. And I certainly know some phone companies have talked about producing specific phones which just will not have those gateways into the wider web.
Yeah, so you can have certain apps for school or whatever. You can text your mum, you can phone your dad when you're away from school, but there's not the sort of app capacity. I'm always like sort of intrigued by how other parents kind of navigate this. I think one of my favourite stories was Liz Truss saying she used to make everyone in her family lock their phone in the box overnight. I love it.
I've just ruled it out to great unpopularity at home, saying you're not having it until you're at least 16. And it's tough, and so I feel for all the parents who struggle with this. And just on the point around mental health, I think, you know, children's minds, the human mind isn't fully developed till you're about 25, and so this constant stimulation on phones is really bad for our children's long-term future. So I salute all the parents who do try.
Thanks both very much indeed. Lots of agreement on this subject clearly on the panel this evening. Coming up next on the Politics Hub. Caught on camera, Sky News witnesses the impact that shoplifting is having on small businesses. But up next, UK inflation rises for the first time in 3 months. What's going on? We'll take you through the detail next. Hello, welcome back. You're watching The Politics Hub. Right, let's talk inflation, the economic data set that perhaps we all feel in our lives more than any other, whether it's the cost of a supermarket shop or how on earth you can afford to get through Christmas. Well, today, new figures show inflation rose for the first time in 3 months, which means the cost of living is going up, and it's more likely that interest rates will stay frozen next month as well. Our data and economics editor, Ed Conway, has the details.
Well, there's an understandable, a lot of focus on the cost of living. Of course, the best measure of the cost of living is inflation. This is just the rate at which prices are changing each year. You can see that the higher the line is, the higher the annual rate of inflation. Of course, you can see the cost of living crisis. It's come down to where the Bank of England would rather like it to be, so around that 2% range. But these latest numbers showing that it's actually gone up a little bit, up to 2.3% in October, raising the question, what is it that's pushing up prices? Well, for the most part, it is one thing. It is energy. If you look at the shopping basket, as it were, of different categories of things we're spending our money on, by far and away the biggest increase was in these housing and housing services, which includes energy, actually 0.5 percentage points of that 2.3%. All of that came from energy. So a big part is energy in terms of that change. But it's worth also looking at different parts of inflation. So it's not just that shopping basket we've heard about, it's also house prices. House price inflation, that's running relatively high at the moment, up above 2% as well, getting towards 3%, of course, having come down quite low. But what about rents? This is another thing that's not normally focused on quite so much inflation. Rental inflation is running even faster. So if you're renting, you're seeing your rent increase at more than 8%. Now, all of this stuff, all of this data has a bearing on just what people think is likely to happen to interest rates in the next few months. Right now, interest rates are at that level there, 4.75%. But next summer, this is just showing you what out there in the market people expect to happen next summer. Next summer, back in September, people thought that next summer rates were going to get down to 3.5%. Then came the budget. And of course, all the extra spending in the budget meant people reconsidered. They reconsidered, and then after that, they thought, no, actually, rates aren't going to come down that far. They're only going to come down to about 4%. This change in inflation that we've just seen today, it doesn't make much difference to that. It's really the budget. And when it comes to the budget, final thing I want to show you, OK, we showed you a chart a bit like this after the budget, showing you just how much UK government borrowing rates changed in the wake of previous budgets and how much they changed in the wake of this one. And the striking thing is here, look, the cost of borrowing for the UK, the government, versus Germany, versus America, got more expensive because the government was borrowing more. However, and this is the critical thing here, this was nothing like the kind of roller coaster that was seen in these rates after the mini-budget.
Ed Conway there, talking us through all the data and the figures. Now, shoplifting has been increasing across the UK, with one store manager telling Sky News it's now out of control. We've been investigating the impact it's having on small businesses, with video footage showing thieves lunging at the camera with knives. Another boy caught stealing, simply laughing and shrugging. Our People and Politics correspondent Nick Martin reports.
So it's quite a busy location, isn't it?
Yeah, so we opened in 2019.
I'm going to spend a few days in a city centre convenience store, which is being plagued by shoplifting. Over the past few months, shop workers here have grappled with thieves. They've been threatened with knives. And this is where the brazen come to steal, knowing there will be no consequences.
It is out of control, if I'm honest with you, across. I mean, we've got 5 stores around the country, and it's a big problem in all of them.
We've only just got here. And mid-interview, a man walks into the store, picks up an item and drops it straight into his bag. A shop assistant spots it immediately.
And what was going on there?
I think he's put something in his bag and he's trying to stop him.
The man is told to put the item into a basket. But a few minutes later, the basket and its contents are found dumped on the floor, and the man has left. Matt looks back on the CCTV cameras because it doesn't add up.
So from my experience, I would say he intended to steal those. He had no intention of paying for that if the colleague hadn't have intervened.
The whole store is covered by cameras, and shop worker Anton keeps a close eye on the stock. We watch as a schoolboy comes into the store. He picks up 3 bags of crisps and stuffs them into his bag. Anton is watching. He waits at the front door to see if the boy tries to leave without paying.
Bag. Come on. Put here. Everything. Okay, yeah. All of them.
The bag is opened and out come the crisps.
Okay. Can go out, yeah? Don't come here every time, yeah?
He's told not to come back, but the police aren't called and the boy is allowed to leave.
What's he doing? Another one. Yeah. Stealing.
For more than a decade, anyone shoplifting goods with a value of under £200 have received a less serious punishment. Since then, shoplifting's gone up by a third, while those being charged has fallen. A few minutes later, another youngster puts something into his bag. Anton is poised again.
Yeah, don't come here anymore. We are on the CCTV. Get out.
The boy responds by laughing. But this is no joke for independent retailers like Ricky Dougal, who owns this store.
What's generally the response from the police when you call them about an incident?
The police do not want to know, really. When they do come out, they don't want to do anything about it. Because right now, nothing's happening at all. They're not being prosecuted. It's a slap on the wrist, make a note of their name, and that's it.
Retailers are fed up, as an exclusive Sky News and Association of Convenience Stores survey shows. 80% of shopkeepers surveyed had an incident of retail crime in the past week. 94% of shopkeepers say in their experience shoplifting has got worse over the last year. 83% of them are not confident that the police will take action against the perpetrators of retail crime on their premises.
The people committing that crime know that most occasions nothing's going to happen to them.
It seems to be okay for anyone to steal.
Yeah.
Without consequence.
Oh, definitely without consequence.
They can get away with it.
Yeah.
The government says it wants to introduce stronger measures to tackle shoplifting, as well as introducing a separate offence for assaulting shop workers. Retailers say this kind of thing cannot continue, that shoplifting must have consequences if the problem is to be properly tackled. Nick Martin, Sky News.
All right, let's chat again, shall we, to Rachel and Marina. What's your sort of take when you look at the video of, like, it's quite blatant, isn't it, some of it?
Yeah, I mean, in defence of the police for a moment, I think, since the 70s, 80s, they have had to prioritise what crimes they investigate. But I think what's shocking right now is at the same time as taking forward cases against journalists, those non-crime incidents for what people might tweet, they've got the resources to do that, but they're not willing to prosecute shoplifters who are so brazen. And perhaps there's a wider issue here in society, because perhaps compared to the 70s and 80s, where people were less likely to do this, to see schoolboys nicking crisps, as has just been shown, it's just shocking. And there's a job for society as a whole, for the parents, I think, to play more of a role than perhaps is the case today.
I mean, it's come just after our report on inflation, right? Showing inflation ticking up, and obviously the cost of living is really exacerbated. Do you think it has exacerbated? That's a question, I guess, Rachel. Do you think it has made it worse? Do you think the cost of living is partly to blame here?
I think much of this crime isn't associated with the cost of living. I certainly have been round many of the shops. I've done a tour of shops to really understand the scale of this. One local retailer lost 31,000 in 6 months of stock. And a lot of this is highly organised crime, people coming in, sweeping shelves into their bag, and they're out.
So you're seeing a lot in your constituency then, are you?
A real sharp rise in retail crime, and that's why when the last government relaxed the laws around crimes under £200, it automatically gave a passport for people to be able to enter those premises with the confidence that they won't be prosecuted, and why Labour is reversing that and ensuring that all crime is prosecuted, and of course working with the police locally, looking at how we can get the system to work better, collecting CCTV, making the forms easier for shopkeepers, because we see how many crimes are committed in one store in a very short period of time as well. So it's really important to get the infrastructure right, and to ensure that these young people in particular are taken into a different life out of crime, but where prosecution is needed, that is expedient.
What would you say to this allegation that the previous government shouldn't have reduced or put that limit in?
No, I mean ultimately theft is still theft, and the police are able to take forward the cases that they wish to. They've, as I said, over a great period of time under both governments, Labour and Conservative, have come to their own conclusions as to where there should be a line, but that's never been a hard and fast line. As I say, I mean, what's shocking is that they do have the time, they do have the resources, and from three forces in the case of Alison Pearson that we've seen recently, to investigate tweets. So the resources, the officers are there, and there's actually never been more officers than there are now. But at the same time, they're not willing to investigate theft from shops.
I mean, I guess, as your party keep telling us, this is a time where resources are really tight. I've reported on cases of rape victims, sexual assault victims waiting 5-6 years for justice. Is it really the best use of police time to prosecute someone nicking 3 bags of crisps from a supermarket?
Well, it's not just about that person taking 3 bags of crisps. There's a lot of infrastructure behind that. There's a lot going on. And it's like, what does that person then go on to? So those early interventions really do make a difference. And that's why Yvette Cooper's clearly set out a whole strategy around retail crime, including putting more community police officers on the street, because it isn't just about the police. It's about the public working with the police around small crime, but also recognising where there is organised crime, how this feeds into county lines, for example, as well, and the connectivity with that. So none of this can be just dismissed. It's got to be understood and addressed.
Yeah, so it's an important point you make about organised crime and gangs doing it, certainly. Thanks both very much indeed. Now, on tomorrow's show, we're going to play you an interview that I've done today with the former Culture Secretary, Nadine Dorries. Now, we talk about her new book, about the collapse of the Conservative government, but I did also want to ask her about her story earlier this week in a newspaper column, which was following the resignation of the Archbishop of Canterbury, where she said that she was abused by a Church of England vicar when she was a young girl. I've just done the interview before coming on air, and we'll show you the full thing tomorrow. But I found it very, very moving, so I did want to bring you a little bit of it this evening, just as what she told me earlier about how her experience affected her. You said that you had lived with a shame about what happened, and that now you're angry, and I can sense that anger. I find it kind of heartbreaking that you have carried this shame, and I know that obviously, we're talking about their little boys, who's been, many of them now men, of course, who have shared their story, and I'm sure the tragedy is that many of them will feel shame as well.
Yeah, it ruins your life. It literally ruins your life.
Is that what you feel? You feel it's ruined your life?
I feel it's ruined my life, and I think the big sadness for me is that I never discussed it with my husband. Never. And he's gone now, and I can't discuss it with him. And I think that's the biggest sadness for me. And I still don't discuss it with my children, my daughters, who are grown women now. They know about it. And the youngest says to me, Mum, she said to me about when I spoke to her about these young boys, she said, you need to write more about you, you need to talk about more about you. And I said, I can't, I don't like doing it. And she said, it's nothing to be ashamed of.
There's nothing to be ashamed of, Ray. She's right, isn't she, obviously? But I guess the great tragedy here is that so many survivors of these awful things do feel shame, and that is why I think it's so important to bring you interviews like that one with Nadine, and I really salute her talking about an issue that she obviously doesn't feel comfortable talking about. She doesn't want to talk about it, but she is talking about it because she obviously feels that something has got to change. You can watch the full interview with Nadine Dorries tomorrow night at 7 p.m. That's here on the Politics Hub. Still to come on the Politics Hub this evening. Keir Starmer returns to the UK after his most recent foreign trip. But just how does a Prime Minister strike a balance between the demands of the world stage and voters back home?
Coming up on the UK Tonight at 8, calls for the police to get serious about shoplifting as offences hit a 20-year high. Plus, I speak to the independent advocate for survivors of abuse at Harrods, who says Mohammed Al-Fayed's abuse stretched far beyond the department store's walls. That and much more on the UK Tonight at 8.
competition in the country. He is expected to win his third term in these elections.
Jubilation in the streets, while some emotional.
This is a political victory for Prime Minister Modi and his Hindu Nationalist Party, a promise fulfilled. I'm Neville Lazarus and I'm Sky's reporter based in Delhi.
He paid over 50,000 to traffickers to get him to America. Instead, he was kidnapped, tied up and threatened by smugglers. A commando from the state force walks me through to a Mai Tai village on the front line.
Firing the civilian and they're burning our house.
We cross to the opposite side, held by the Guppies.
When they fire, we have to retaliate.
Sky News get the full story first. Companies like these are helping India in its trajectory to be a serious player in space exploration.
The enthusiasm is palpable. The young desire change.
These elections are a pivotal moment for the country's economic and political history. The concern here is that the public healthcare system is inadequate.
In a prayer, she's asking God to help understand what happened. I cannot carry on. God, help me. He says his world has crashed. Like him, there are scores of families searching for their loved ones.
Too often have families endured such tragedies for the negligence not only by the administration, but also by spiritual people in this country. Free wherever you get your news. Even though it has few seats in parliament, Kashmir is symbolic and very significant. It's often been called a nuclear flashpoint.
This may be the Premier League.
I'm not like everybody else.
But this duo have been in a league of their own. It's Healey, a striker like no other.
Like everybody else.
Son, Starman for Tottenham Hotspur.
Like everybody else.
That's just stunning. Wow!
Like everybody else. Like everybody else.
Manchester City, Tottenham on NBC and Peacock.
Hello, welcome back to the Politics Hub. Well, Keir Starmer is now back from Brazil after attending the G20 summit in Rio. It's been a whirlwind of overseas visits for him since entering Downing Street, reflecting the gravity of global politics that we've been discussing tonight. But of course, the farming protests in London yesterday during his absence perhaps shows the challenge of balancing the foreign and domestic agenda as Prime Minister. We'll discuss that in a minute, but first, let's have a reminder of his foreign trips so far.
Come here to Washington, 3,500 miles from home. And now let me turn to the Commonwealth. We've travelled a long way to get here. I'm here at the G20.
Right, let's talk to Rachel and Ranil. I mean, there's been a lot of travel, but then I guess, you know, there is a defence, isn't there? I mean, just look at what's happening with the world, Rachel.
Well, it's a new government and clearly a new Prime Minister, and he needs to go and put his footprint across the world, literally meeting leaders, but also a series of really important summits, whether it was the COP summit and setting out an agenda there with the climate emergency, or indeed the G20 and meeting those global leaders at a time when the world for a generation has not been so unstable. So it's absolutely vital that the Prime Minister is making those new acquaintances, setting up the stall for the UK, but also forming that strategy which is so desperately needed at the moment. And it does feel that the UK is back in power in a global state, providing that leadership, and that's what we've needed to see for quite some time, and that's certainly the feedback we're getting from so many nations as the Prime Minister and others are putting their footprint out there.
I mean, it's hard, isn't it? It's a tough thing for any Prime Minister to balance because, you know, we had the farmers' protests as an example, right? You know, where thousands of farmers marched on Westminster and the PM is on the other side of the world. It's a tricky balance.
Yeah, I mean, clearly the people who elect the Prime Minister indirectly through Parliament are the British people, not people anywhere else in the world. And so ultimately the Prime Minister is accountable to us. And so, of course, domestic affairs must be important to any Prime Minister. I do find it a little hypocritical, I have to say, that he complained about Rishi and previous Conservative Prime Ministers having a jet, flying around the world, and now he's discovered, of course, that quite rightly it is the job of the British Prime Minister, as well as domestic priorities, to extol the virtue of British values around the world. I just wish that he'd do a little bit more of it when he goes. I think at the G20, he didn't say very much to anyone about anything, and so he travelled all that way for very little benefit to our country. And I think if you look at also what happened at COP, you know, the number of heads of government who actually travelled there were very few in number. The US wasn't there, Canada wasn't there, you know, many European countries weren't there. So I think he's got to be judicious in the trips that he goes on to make sure he's really delivering for the British people.
What would you say to that?
Well, first of all, I think COP is, obviously we're seeing how that unfolds, but a really, really important conference, because if we're talking about the climate challenges, the greatest challenges facing our planet at this time. So it's important that he provides the leadership there, and certainly seeing us move forward at COP, really important. But I do think the Prime Minister himself has got that heavy responsibility in taking our agenda overseas, opening up trade, but also he is part of a cabinet, and being able to trust cabinet ministers to get on with the domestic agenda is really important too.
Great to have you both here. We are out of time. It was a good excuse for us to play that great Daft Punk song there, I will say that. That is it from us tonight. I'll see you tomorrow at 7. Up next, it is UK Tonight with Sarah Jane Mee. She's going to be discussing that shoplifting story in a little bit more detail.